All right. Hello, students. This is Dr. Esmacher. We are winding down the current semester as of this recording, spring 2021. And today we're going to talk about how the Civil War and Reconstruction end up resulting in what historians call a constitutional revolution. Our Constitution was made with a built-in mechanism for improvement and reform. And what we're going to talk about today is the fact that while the Constitution has been changed many times, in fact, we have, I believe at last count, 28 amendments. While the Constitution has been changed many times, some of those changes are more substantive than others. So we're going to talk today about the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendments, which together drastically reframed the Constitution and who enjoyed the benefits of the Constitution. So in order to talk about why the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are such game changers, we have to backtrack a little bit and talk about slavery in the Civil War, because the First Amendment we're going to talk about today, the 13th Amendment, is the one that abolishes slavery in the United States once and for all. So when you're talking about the American Civil War, you really can't separate slavery from the Civil War, much as adherents to the Lost Cause mythology try. Civil War is woven, or excuse me, slavery is woven into the fabric of the American Civil War. The southern states that broke away from the United States, that seceded, did so to preserve their right to own slaves, which they felt was indeed a right. So yes, states' rights, but states' rights to allow slavery is really what kickstarts the war. And so even though initially ending slavery was not the end game for the Union or the North during the Civil War, slavery is still central to the Civil War from the beginning. And one of the reasons why ending slavery is not initially the goal for the Union or the North is that they're more concerned with keeping all of the different states together, number one, okay, to preserve the Union, as many people said. But number two, when we look at geography, there's another very important reason why ending slavery is not initially the primary goal of the Civil War on the side of the North. When you look at attitudes about slavery in the North before the Civil War, 2/3 of all slaves in the United States who were liberated or emancipated between 1831 and the Civil War were located in the United States. Okay. In fact, between 1831 and 1888, which is about the time we see the end of slavery in the Western Hemisphere, a lot of those slaves were from the United States, because many of the Latin American nations who'd broken away from Spain earlier than 1831 had ended slavery when they became independent. And the United States was one of the last holdouts in the Americas. The very last holdout in the Americas was the nation of Brazil, which had formerly been a Portuguese colony. In the United States, if you look at the map here on this slide, the states in the red are the states that broke away and became part of the Confederacy. And then the states in the various shades of blue are the states that remained in the United States, aka the Union. You'll notice this light blue area on the map. These are what we call the border states. So not only are they the states that straddle the north-south boundary line, in fact, Maryland, for example, is underneath the Mason-Dixon line that kind of separated what was north and what was south. But these states also were states that still had slavery. So yes, we still had a number of states, including Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri, that remained in the North, in the Union, but still had slaves. And there was this concern that if we made ending slavery a goal of the war on the part of the North, that these border states might defect. They might break away and join the Confederacy. And that would add about another 2.6 million people, including 500,000 slaves, to the Confederacy. It also would have alienated more conservative Northerners like Senator John Crittenden of Kentucky, who actually passed a resolution in Congress in 1861 to specifically say, hey, I just want to go on the record and say that we're not trying to end slavery with this war. So when slavery becomes an end goal, ending slavery becomes an end goal of the war, is around 1862. Part of this is that emancipation of African Americans who were enslaved, and remember, emancipation means freeing. Emancipation of slaves becomes a strategy to win the war. A group of Republicans called Radical Republicans, who were the part of the Republican Party that was the most, we would today probably use the word progressive in terms of race. They wanted to completely get rid of slavery. They wanted to make African Americans equal to white people in American society. So they're kind of considered sort of fringe people at this point in time. But they convinced President Abraham Lincoln over time that slavery was the key to the South, that it was so important to the economy of the South that if you get rid of slavery, or you say ending slavery is going to be our goal, that that's going to destabilize and undermine the Southern economy and hurt the Confederate war effort. Initially, though, Lincoln is hesitant to embrace this idea of the radical Republicans because, again, he's worried about the border states breaking away and becoming Confederate. However, we start to see policies shifting in that direction. In the spring of 1862, Congress forbids the Union Army from returning any fugitive slaves. Prior to that, the official policy of the Union Army was that if slaves had run away to Union lines seeking freedom, that the Army was supposed to return them to their Southern masters, which they didn't always do. But now that's banned. There's also a move to abolish slavery, not only in the District of Columbia, Washington, D.C., but also the territories, with the owners being compensated for the financial loss of their slaves being freed. Then in July of 1862, Congress passes the Second Confiscation Act, which said that any slave owner living in the border states, if they showed that they were disloyal to the Union, they could have their slaves confiscated and freed as punishment. And it also officially made the practice of slaves getting to the Union line becoming free a reality. So they actually put it into policy. So 1862 is a really important year in terms of thinking about slavery as an ending slavery as an end goal of the war. Lincoln particularly sees this increasingly as a winning strategy by providing more manpower for the military, by allowing African Americans to join, by getting more support for the war from abolitionist movements. But what really ends up sealing the deal is the Confederacy had been trying to get Great Britain to intervene on their behalf using cotton as a bargaining chip. However, Great Britain had gotten rid of slavery back in the 1830s. And so Lincoln reasoned that if he specifically made ending slavery a formal goal for the North in fighting the war, that would help ruin any chance that the Confederacy had of getting Great Britain as an ally. So in September 1862, Lincoln issues a warning to the South. He says, if you don't surrender by the year's end, we're going to move to formally abolish slavery. And this was risky, for sure, because again, we still had the border states, we still had lots of more conservative people fearing the implications for all of these free Africans, and fearing like loss of white privilege and other kinds of things. But the South didn't budge. And so on January 1st, 1863, Abraham Lincoln signs an executive order that we call the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, I want to be very clear with you. The Emancipation Proclamation does not end slavery. What it does is it says any slave living in the Confederacy or territories controlled by the Confederacy is now considered free. I apologize if you heard jingling. Apparently my dog Mateo has an itch. So, I mean, realistically, this doesn't touch slaves that live in the border states, right, that still belong to the North. They're not included in the Emancipation Proclamation. It also doesn't realistically immediately free anybody because it's talking about territory still controlled by the Confederacy. What it does do, though, is it signals to Africans who are still enslaved in the South that the North is committed to ending slavery, and it encourages them to run away, to engage in acts of sabotage against their owner and the Confederate Army and military effort. It also signifies that there's going to be a commitment, a real commitment to ending slavery. There's no more talk of compensating owners for financial loss. There's no more talk of, well, when these Africans are freed, we're going to ship them back to Africa and encourage them to colonize there. No. Okay. We're talking about radically remaking American society to allow for freedom and equality for people of African descent. So the Emancipation Proclamation opens up new opportunities for African Americans in the war effort, particularly even though African Americans had already been serving on equal footing with white people in the Navy, the Emancipation Proclamation allows them more access to sign up for the Army. And the most famous Army group of African Americans in the Civil War is the 54th Massachusetts Volunteers. They are the real-life inspiration behind the movie Glory, if you've ever seen it, which depicts their 1863 attack on Fort Wagner in South Carolina. African Americans in the Army were segregated at this time and will continue to be segregated into Black-only units until 1948, when the armed forces are officially desegregated. And at this point in time, they were not allowed to be officers. The 54th Massachusetts Volunteers was actually commanded by a white man. But the effort of the 54th Massachusetts at the Fort Wagner battle really helped prove the skill and the bravery of African American troops. As my students read last week in the selection from For Cause and Comrades, a lot of white troops became swayed towards ending slavery when they saw the real life implications of African Americans fighting meant, you know, more people helping, less likelihood that you're going to get shot if you have someone else in the ranks. So really that's going to boost morale. For these emancipated slaves, enlisting in the armed forces gave them freedom. Most of these volunteers were escaped slaves or people in the border states where enlisting would guarantee your freedom and freedom for your family as well. Now, there is a distinct difference in treatment between the Army and the Navy. The Navy did not segregate African Americans and gave them equal pay and promotion opportunities, whereas the Army did not allow African Americans to become officers, segregated them into Black-only units, and underpaid them compared to white soldiers, $10 a month compared to $16 a month. And African Americans who fought in the Army were not only more likely to do non-combat jobs, kind of like grunt work, but also if they were captured by the Confederacy, they were far more likely to be executed or re-enslaved. Congress did address the unequal pay in 1865 by passing legislation that gave retroactive back pay to remedy the difference. About 180,000 African Americans served in the Army and 24,000 in the Navy during the Civil War. 15 African Americans received the Medal of Honor, and many African Americans after the war used their military service to become leaders within their community, not only sort of informally as parts of the social and business community, but also running for political office. And fighting in the war gave African Americans the ability to make arguments for the full rights of citizenship, including voting, because they were willing to fight and die for the cause of the Union. We also see African Americans working behind enemy lines to help the Union war effort. One of the more notable examples of this is Harriet Tubman, who prior to the Civil War had led many different groups of slaves out of the South to freedom in the North. And during the Civil War, she actually becomes the first woman to lead a military expedition and successfully frees more slaves with the help of the Union Army. And the screen cap is from Drunk History. I highly recommend watching this segment on Harriet Tubman. You can find it on YouTube. So, with the North making ending slavery a goal of the war, and with African Americans proving their loyalty and their mettle to the United States by fighting in the war, supporting the war effort, the Congress of the United States passes the 13th Amendment, which is ratified by December of 1865. The 13th Amendment officially outlaws the practice of slavery in the United States. Now notice that asterisk there, it still allows for unfree labor as punishment. So prison labor exists because of this loophole in there. And many people have talked in terms of prison reform about this being very problematic. But in terms of the practice of people becoming slaves and being owned by other people, that is outlawed in the United States as of 1865, which is a big deal. Now, 1865 is the year the Civil War ends, formally in April of 1865, with the surrender of Robert E. Lee to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. Shortly thereafter, Abraham Lincoln is actually assassinated, and Lincoln's vice president, Andrew Johnson, takes over as president. And it's up to Johnson to oversee this process, or the start of this process, known as Reconstruction. So Reconstruction is the name given to this time period immediately after the Civil War. And the process of it was to rebuild not only the nation, which had literally been torn into two by the American Civil War, but also to rehabilitate and remake the South. One of the things that the North really wanted to do was to make sure that the South actually obeyed new laws like the 13th Amendment, right? And they did actually get rid of slavery. And they also realized that the South needed to be rebuilt not only physically, because a lot of destruction, most of the battles took place in the South, but also economically, because they no longer have the system of labor, slavery, that had sustained their economy before. So the South needs to be completely reinvented physically, economically, and also socially and culturally, now that African Americans were considered free. Now, the first attempt at Reconstruction by Andrew Johnson is what we call presidential Reconstruction. Johnson is interesting. He is not Lincoln's VP for long. Lincoln specifically chooses him when he runs for re-election in 1864 as a way to sort of unify the North. Johnson is a Southerner who, even though he was from Tennessee, which was a state that had seceded, he was a staunch supporter of the Union, and he's not as expansive a visionary as Lincoln. He is far more supportive of states' rights, whereas Lincoln was more supportive of a unified nation. And he's also very deeply racist, even by the standards of the time. Johnson's plan for Reconstruction is to go easy on the South. Now, that's not to say that Lincoln was a hard ass or had planned to be a hard ass. Lincoln was also pretty lenient, but Johnson even more so. Basically, Johnson said, all right, here's how Reconstruction is going to work. I'm going to offer a blanket pardon to everybody in the South, and that allows you to have the right to vote again. That allows you to have property rights again, unless you're members of the Southern elite. So people who, like, for example, were political officials in the Confederate government, or people who owned $2,000 worth of pre-war property, so in other words, the really rich people who probably had plantations and slaves, which sounds great, right? Pardoning most people, but holding the people in power accountable, except for then he goes to individually pardon all of the people in power who should have been held accountable. He also then appoints provisional governors and tells the Southerners to hold conventions to draft new state constitutions. And he goes, all you have to do is three things. You have to, in these new state constitutions, recognize that slavery no longer exists. You have to recognize that you cannot secede from the United States. That's a no-no. And you have to refuse to pay back any Confederate debt. That's it. Those are the only parameters he gives them. So the problem with Johnson's plan is it puts back in power the exact same people who were in power before the Civil War and who caused the Civil War in the first place. And they were not willing to give African Americans equal rights or any kind of respect. And this eventually puts Johnson on a crash course with the radical Republicans, particularly over legislation that was nicknamed the Black Codes. So when these new Southern state governments were recreated, one of the things that they did was they passed a series of laws that only applied to African Americans. Okay, that's why they were called the Black Codes. These same laws did not apply to white people. While they did grant African Americans certain rights, like they could marry, own property, have some legal rights in court, they were not allowed to vote. They could not testify against white people in court. They could not sit on juries or serve in state militias. There were also laws passed that said that African Americans could not work in certain jobs. And some states actually passed laws to try to prevent African Americans from owning land. And those two provisions, the limitations on jobs and the limitations on access to land, were designed to make it so that African Americans could not compete against poorer white people for certain jobs. Many states also made it mandatory for African Americans to have a 1-year labor contract. And if you could not produce your labor contract at any point in time, if someone demanded it of you, you would be arrested and then forced to work on either the plantations of your former masters or basically as prison labor for anybody who wanted cheap labor that could rent convicts. Parents could also see their children forced to work against their will with this. If this sounds a lot like another kind of slavery, arresting and imprisoning African Americans and then forcing them to work, you'd be right. And so this really, really makes the radical Republicans very angry. They go, look, not only is this deeply racist because you're not making white people follow these same rules, but it also violates our notions of free labor, right? That everybody has the opportunity economically to do what they want. And again, like, you didn't really punish the people who were in charge, and they continue to be horrible. So what radical Republicans do is they decide that they're going to challenge Johnson's plan for Reconstruction. As I mentioned, radical Republicans tended to be sort of more, to use the label today, but we would use progressive on issues like things like race. They tended to come from regions like New England or other areas in the North, areas that had long been strongholds for not only the abolitionist movement that had worked to end slavery, but also areas that were home to religious revivalism, like hotbeds of the Second Great Awakening. So these were people who had very deep convictions, often driven by religion and this deep sense of equality. So Charles Sumner and Thaddeus Stevens, who is pictured here, were two of the kind of the big wigs in the radical Republican camp. You might remember Charles Sumner because he was almost beaten to death on the floor of the Senate by Preston Brooks. And the radical Republicans really wanted equal rights above all else. They are more comfortable with using federal power to ensure that everybody has equal rights. So because of this, they wanted to take action to punish people in the South who had caused the war. They wanted to punish people in the South who had passed these black codes. And some of them wanted to embrace the idea of land reform, of seizing land from these wealthy Confederate elite and giving that land to former slaves, which, by the way, doesn't end up happening for a variety of reasons. But they believed that if you were really going to reconstruct the nation and reconstruct the South, you needed to radically change Southern culture. So radical Republicans worked together with moderate Republicans to try to counter Johnson's plan for Reconstruction, which everybody recognized was deeply flawed. And they were able to make progress on this front because they refused to seat elected representatives from these new Southern state governments, arguing that these new governments were illegitimate. So in 1866, Congress passes the Civil Rights Bill, which does a couple of things. It declares anybody born in the U.S. as automatically a citizen, so we call birthright citizenship, and they enjoy basic rights regardless of what race they are. It requires states to have colorblind laws to give equal protection under law to everyone, and states could not restrict labor. So in other words, they couldn't prevent, like, say, African Americans from holding certain jobs. Now, when this law is passed, Johnson vetoes it. He argues that not only does it infringe on Southern state rights, but it discriminates against white people. Again, Johnson is very deeply racist. Congress has the votes, though. They override the veto, which is the first time that a major law in Congress overrides a presidential veto. And they decide then that Johnson is not going to budge, that they're going to have to work against Johnson to pass a new plan for Reconstruction. One of the things that they do then is they realize that while they at that time had the numbers to pass the Civil Rights Bill, that any piece of legislation can be undone fairly easily with another piece of legislation. So they realized that if they were really going to make these kinds of changes permanent, it had to be put in the Constitution. So the Civil Rights Bill of 1866 becomes the basis for what will become the 14th Amendment, which is officially ratified in 1868. The 14th Amendment does a couple of things, but the two most important things that the 14th Amendment does is it establishes what we call birthright citizenship. So the idea that anybody born in the United States, regardless of whether your parents are citizens, if you're born in the United States, you are a citizen. So that automatically gives citizenship to African Americans who, because of the Dred Scott versus Sanford Supreme Court ruling, had previously been denied citizenship, even though they were born in the United States. The 14th Amendment also guarantees that everyone gets equal protection under law. It prohibits this notion that you can pass laws that apply to some groups and not others. And basically, it gives the national government the authority to intervene if states are seen as violating rights of certain groups of people. There's also a provision that if a state government denies a group to vote, that they will have reduced representation in Congress, which has never been actually deployed, but that clause is there. There was a very fierce battle about ratifying the 14th Amendment. Some radical Republicans argued it didn't go far enough because it doesn't explicitly guarantee the right to vote for African Americans. Johnson hated it, made it part of the midterm election campaign. He went across and traveled across the nation by railroad and condemned it. And in the end, though, it still gets the number of votes necessary to be officially added to the Constitution. The reaction of Johnson to the proposed 14th Amendment in 1866 really enables a lot of momentum by his political opponents. Radical Republicans do really well in the midterm elections of 1866, and they're able, with this newly elected crop of supporters, to pass a new plan for Reconstruction called the Reconstruction Act of 1867. Again, Johnson tries to veto this. Again, Congress overrides him. Basically, what Radical Reconstruction does is it says, okay, we have to start all over, scrap whatever has been done. We're not recognizing the legitimacy of presidential Reconstruction. What we're going to do is we're going to make all of the Southern states have to start over again with creating new Southern state constitutions. However, you've got to allow Black people or Black men the right to vote. And you also have to have these new state constitutions created by people elected by all Southerners. So in other words, you have to include African Americans, you have to include poor white people as part of your political constituents to create these new governments. And until these Southern states could create new governments, the South will be occupied militarily by the Army. So the South is divided into 5 military districts to oversee this. Johnson is very, very resistant to this. In fact, he's so incensed by Radical Reconstruction that Radical Republicans are afraid he's just going to lash out at his cabinet members. And so they actually pass a law called the Tenure of Office Act in 1867, which prohibits the president from removing any members of his cabinet without Senate approval. Johnson considers this an attack on his executive authority, and so he fires Secretary of War Edwin Stanton anyways in 1868, violating the Tenure of Office law, and setting up his impeachment. So Congress, the House of Representatives, elect to impeach Johnson. He will be the first president ever impeached in American history, although not the last. And remember, the way impeachment works is that the House investigates whether there is sufficient evidence to suggest there may have been wrongdoing by a federal official, in this case, President Johnson, and they basically vote on likely charges, and then the actual trial of those charges happens in the Senate. So the House is in charge of impeachment, articles of impeachment. Once those are decided on, if the president or other federal official is impeached, then the Senate has to put them on trial and find them guilty or not guilty. You can only be removed from office if the Senate finds you guilty. Johnson was not removed from office. To this date, we've never had a president impeached and then removed as well from office. And Johnson ends up avoiding conviction by promising in a backroom deal not to interfere with Reconstruction if they choose to acquit him. So Johnson is, in fact, acquitted and allowed to remain president for the remainder of his term. He does not choose to run again. 1868 is an election year. So basically, Johnson is saying, please don't kick me out prematurely. I promise to behave. So in light of that, the last major piece of the constitutional revolution is the passage of the 15th Amendment. Again, looking at the resistance from Johnson, the resistance from Southerners to the 13th and 14th Amendment and to this new plan of Reconstruction, Congress realized that the ability of African Americans to vote needed to be protected. Ulysses S. Grant ends up winning the 1868 presidential election as a Republican candidate, but the election is not as big. He doesn't have as big a win as Congress would like, and so Congress moved to pass more legislation and more potential constitutional amendments before the tides shifted, before support for change went away. So the 15th Amendment is the last of these Reconstruction-era amendments. It specifically prohibits states from denying the right to vote due to race, and it's officially ratified in 1870. Now, notice one thing that the 15th Amendment doesn't have. It doesn't have it doesn't guarantee the right to vote to women, right? It doesn't say anything about sex. It says you can't discriminate on the basis of race. So this means that voting is still going to be confined to men. And this makes a lot of feminists and suffragettes very angry. In fact, this will cause a split in the American feminist movement between those who felt that, while not perfect, the 15th Amendment was a step in the right direction, right? That will still work for women getting the right to vote. Like, some progress is better than no progress. And then a large group of women who made the argument that unless it included women, like, it was useless. So the feminist movement really is going to be split for the next couple of decades because of the 15th Amendment and the debate over the 15th Amendment. So the legacy, the lasting legacy of the radical Republicans is this fundamental change in the Constitution. The Constitution, because of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, finally settles the issue of slavery that had been plaguing the United States since its birth as a nation as a divisive issue. It puts that to bed. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments also explicitly protect the rights of non-white people in the United States in a way that had never been done before. While the original Constitution and the Declaration of Independence are written in such a way as to sound very inclusive and colorblind and genderblind, the reality was that people didn't have equal protection under law until the 14th Amendment. Non-white people were explicitly barred from citizenship before the 14th Amendment, and unfortunately, even after the 14th Amendment, as we talk more about in History 1302, or the second half of U.S. history, this is going to be a sea change in the history of the Constitution. Now the Constitution explicitly extends to and protects non-white people. Again, even if it's applied imperfectly for many, many years, as we're going to see, this is definitely a step in the right direction. And the immediate legacy of the radical Reconstruction established by the radical Republicans is a very positive one. These new Southern state governments that are established by radical Reconstruction do an awful lot to promote equality. They establish public school systems in the South for the first time. They rebuilt infrastructure. We see a wave of African Americans elected into political office, not only at the local and state level, but also the national level as well. And this alliance politically between African Americans and also poor white people who were left out of political power before the Civil War. Unfortunately, the progress made by Reconstruction will be undone in 1877 when the North abandons the project of Reconstruction. But those changes made by the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are lasting and important ones. And again, even if we don't always evenly apply them throughout U.S. history, the fact that it's in our Constitution, these 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments end up being huge cornerstones of the new Constitution. And in fact, the idea of the 14th Amendment in particular has helped in many Supreme Court cases to guarantee rights of marginalized people. So this is one of the more lasting legacies of the Civil War and Reconstruction era. Thank you guys for listening in. I hope you think differently of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments after this. And y'all have a great rest of your day.